Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Conversation with Professor PLO Lumumba, brought to you by Tiamo Hotle Morapi Foundation. Professor Lumumba, across the continent and globally, you have reiterated sentiments of great Africans like Professor Haile Selassie, Kwame Nkrumah, Mwalimu Nyerere of Tanganyika, Isuju Noel of Burkina Faso. Are the visions still possible? Can Africa abolish colonial borders? Can Africa still have one currency?
All the dreams of the African continent are still valid. Whenever we think about Africa, I always remind my fellow Africans that we must go back to the month of May 1963, when the 32 heads of states and governments of the then independent African countries gathered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The chief high priest, if you may, of the Pan-African movement was Kwame Nkrumah. The reason why we mention Kwame every so often is because he had a sense of urgency which no other leader had. He was acutely conscious that even after regaining independence, there was another more sinister adversary, much more pernicious, the neo-colonial construct. And he therefore said, we must unite now. We must have one army now. We must have one government now. We must have one currency now. We must do all these before we are divided and before we get used to our inherited power structures. There are those who thought that we could grow a little bit more gradually. In that group, there was Kambarage Nyerere of Tanzania, who in 1994 actually said, Nkrumah was right, we were wrong. We should have done it then. But that notwithstanding, it gladdens my heart that the African Union under Agenda Africa 2063 has now recognized that indeed the long-term health of Africa not only requires but demands that we are united. And I see a number of movements in the recent past which suggest to me that we are beginning to move in the right direction. One of them is, as I've already indicated, Africa Agenda 2063, whose 7 pillars are speaking to the African aspiration. The other one is the free skies, and much more recently, the African Continental Free Trade Area. So Africa is moving, and Africa will continue to move.
Talking over Agenda 63 and the Africa Trade Agreement, 1.3 billion people coming together to form over 3 trillion economy and the biggest trading bloc in the continent. But though as it may, taking us back, we have had in the past Africans betraying other Africans. As you always allude to, Thomas Sankara was consumed. Controversies around that. His closest friend allegedly involved, Blaise Compaoré, as so many other Africans who were consumed by the imperialist and neo-colonial powers at the hope of other Africans. Are we going to go forward with Africa Trade Agreement and Agenda 63 when the 2 biggest economies in Africa, your Nigeria and your South Africa, are fighting over trade facilities in the name of xenophobia and Afrophobia? How do we unite and make sure that Africa moves in one accord and no one turns to the superpowers for any quick cash or anything that's going to defy what Africa is trying to do as a whole?
Those who delude themselves in believing that it's going to be easy are confused. Throughout history, it has always been demonstrated that all good things take time to happen. If you look at the history of Europe, how many wars have the Europeans fought? If you look at the history of the United States of America, they went through a struggle for independence, they went through a civil war, they went through the civil rights movement, African countries post-independence are only 70 years. And as I see it, I believe that Africa is going to achieve aspirations faster than any other civilization. We should not think that the headwinds and the hiccups that we have spell a death knell for Africa. These are the trials and tribulations that we must go through. These are the birth pangs, but beyond the pangs, there will be an occasion for joy. It is not for the faint-hearted, no instant coffee solutions, but as long as we move forward. Remember, Kwame said, and we repeat this every so often, seek ye first the political kingdom and the rest will come. And as long as we keep on moving forward, we will achieve.
But Professor Lumumba, as Africa is trying to transform its economies to upper middle income and high income, the superpowers are not just resting. We are in the middle and we have the East and the West, the Chinese and the USA, your France's and the UK. Professor, we've seen the return of scramble for Africa.
You know, when people are scrambling for you, it must mean there is something unique about you.
Absolutely. Africa is the richest continent.
Every civilization scrambles for Africa. The Greeks scrambled for Africa. The Jews scrambled for Africa. The Europeans scrambled for Africa. The Chinese are scrambling for Africa. Everybody scrambles for Africa. The only thing that Africa must do is for Africa to begin to define our own agenda, recognizing that the world is a jungle, and in the jungle, survival is for the fittest and death is for the least suitable. All these activities that we are seeing in Africa are suggesting to us that we have already recognized that our weakness is in our disunity. Earlier on, you asked the question, will it affect us if Nigeria and South Africa engage in these unhealthy activities? These are signs of growth, and they are people who are going to try and confuse us, but we must not be confused. It is not for one generation to achieve all that we desire. It is our generation that must lay the foundation stone, and our children and children's children will then make us realize what we desire.
Professor, we know something right now, that we need capital to set up the infrastructure. We need capital to put up infrastructure to deliver water, to deliver investment. Africa is engaged in China, for example, for external funds. How should Africa negotiate? Because there's been a talk that Africa is going to be ripped off in these negotiations in the process. How should Africa negotiate and make sure that it gets the best out of all these deals? Because China recently passed a $60 billion facility to the African continent for infrastructure development.
You know, if you look at Africa Agenda 2063 and look at the 7 pillars, one of the things... Yes.
Be very free to be honest.
Yes. Don't worry. I will be.
Thank you very much.
If you look at Africa Agenda 2063, it says that one of the things that we must have is a prosperous Africa, a peaceful Africa, an Africa that is united, an Africa that is capable of being present in the world. These are some of the things that are being suggested under Africa Agenda 2063. And I want you to look at the fictional letter that is written by Nkosana Dlamini Zuma, who was then the chair of African Union Commission, to Kwame, who is assumed to be Kwame Nkrumah. She says that in the year 2063, Africa will have changed. Africa will have the equivalent of the Silicon Valley in the Congo. Africa will have transport across the continent. Africa will have grown. And I have no doubt in my mind that Africa has the wherewithal. And the recognition that we must engage the world in unity is in itself very critical. It is impossible for little Botswana with a population of 2 million to negotiate with China with a population of 1.4 billion. It is like putting a heavyweight boxer with a featherweight in a ring. It is murder, as Julius Nyerere would have said. What you do is you want another heavyweight, Africa with a population of 1.3 billion, negotiating with China with a population of 1.4 billion, then you have equals. In terms of resources, what don't we have? If it is agriculture, we have it. If it is minerals, we have them. If it is natural resources of all descriptions, we have them. And even the human resource, we have it. What we must do is to harness all those resources and engage China from a position of strength, engage the United States from a position of strength, engage Europe from a position of strength. That is why people don't want Africa to unite. Because the day we unite, the world will never be the same again. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Lumumba. Should we perhaps start negotiating these deals? For a start, as a bloc, as SADC, then the Eastern Bloc, ECOWAS, the Central Africa, so forth, and then we gradually emerge as a one African bloc.
There are two things. There are a number of things that are happening, not two. If you look at Africa now, Africa is organized under regional blocks. SADC with 14 countries, we have ECOWAS, we have the East African Community, we have Central Africa, we have the Maghreb, and we also have COMESA. All these are building blocks. There are certain things that are unique to SADC, which SADC can negotiate as SADC. There are certain things that are unique to ECOWAS, which it can negotiate as such, and East African Community. But ultimately, the desire is that we negotiate as one. And that is the foundation philosophically and practically of the African continental free trade area, that going forward, if you want to come to Africa, negotiate with us as Africa. And not many people are happy with that, because when you begin to negotiate with us as Africa, then you will not take advantage of us. You'll not take advantage of Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire with her cocoa. You will not take advantage of the Democratic Republic of Congo because of her coltant or rare earth, or Niger or Botswana with her diamond. You will negotiate with a continent which knows what it wants, with the people who have clear aspirations, clear goals. And that is what we must be talking about loudly and clearly. And happily, we now have a secretariat of SCTF in Accra, Ghana. The next thing is we go forward, and go forward in a structured way.
Towards our conclusion, bring you closer to home, Africa's model democracy. Just over 2 million people, 53 years of independence, 17% unemployment rate, 60% populated by the youth, going into one of its closely contested elections in its history in 2 weeks to come. We're going to take a minute break, water break. Then I bring in my senior journalist, local journalist, to help us wrap up this conversation about the Botswana. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We just brought the conversation closer to home, Botswana. Professor Lumumba, how does Botswana diversify its economy from overly dependent on diamond revenue?
You are Botswana. You must know the history of this country. In 1966, this was a backwater economy. This economy has succeeded in lifting ourselves with possibly a per capita income now of over 10,000 United States dollars. I'm not talking about the distribution, but this is one of the better African economies. I hear you talking about 17% unemployment. I know that there is youth unemployment. I know all those things, and I know that there is overdependence on diamond.
In the last 10 years,
Yes.
it has regressed.
Yes, I'm coming to that. So that there is a sense in which there are certain things that Botswana has done well over the years. But many African countries are now suffering because we did not grapple with the demographic problem. And we have over-relied on mining, for example, in this country. Your livestock industry was doing very well. You ignored that. I believe there is a lot that could be done in agriculture. I believe that Botswana could play an anchor role within SADC. When you are talking about SADC with 14 countries, you could be a country that provides and diversifies in great ways, in the same way that Singapore has done over the years in that part of the world. So going forward, Botswana, like many African countries, must begin to ask fundamental questions. One of them is, what do we do to ensure that we are not over-dependent in any one area? What do we do with tourism, for example? Look at a country like Turkey. Turkey receives over 90 million visitors every year. Why should Botswana receive 20 million in the next 20 years? Why shouldn't livestock be an industry that thrives? Why shouldn't we go into agriculture through drip irrigation? Why shouldn't we go into other areas? Why shouldn't we be the financial hub in this area? There is no shortage of opportunities, but that demands that we must do something with our planning, do something with our politics, and leverage on our position and our stable character. Botswana has been recognized over the years as a stable country. You moved from Ian Khama, then you went into Festus Mohai, you went, or rather Seretse Khama, Mohai, and Ian, and then you now have an election. A good thing. And I'm very happy that right now you have an election which is a little bit more vibrant than before. That helps because it begins to bring certain critical issues on the surface. And once you begin to grapple with those issues in a meaningful way, it means that your democracy is maturing and your country is strengthening. So don't be worried about what is happening now. It is, your country is in what one may describe as a maturing stage, which is a good thing.
I'll get back to Professor Lumumba. Welcome, Spike Ranezang. Can we do all that the professor has just alluded to in agriculture, in tourism, in livestock and beef, with state-owned enterprises? Do we still need state-owned enterprises?
I say no. I think it is time Botswana and the rest of Africa, in fact, started embracing the concept of privatization and reducing the role of government into a more facilitatory and regulatory role, and letting the private sector thrive. But with countries like Botswana, for example, we are to a very large extent a welfare state. There is a lot of dependency on government. There's a lot of income inequality. So you find that we have a problem where we still have to support our people, to help them to rise up. Which brings me to two issues that I would like you to comment on. One, do you believe in the concept of indigenous citizen economic empowerment? That is one. Two, Botswana is now saying, no, we are opening our borders for foreign direct investment, and we want the private sector to come and set up here, and so on and so forth. But then that comes at a time when the citizens are, to a large extent, very underdeveloped, which means that when the moneyed people come in, yes, they will come and create employment and so on, but there is a concern over the level at which citizens are going to play in their own economy. There is a concern over whether Botswana are going to be able to compete, I mean, like on an equal footing with investors if they are now still underdeveloped. Thank you.
Let me address two issues. There is this notion that we believe that private sector is a solution to all our problems. I don't share in that view. I hold the view that there must be a mix. There is a sense in which in certain areas government must be present, but be present in a manner which borrows from private sector DNA, so that they are present in those sectors because they take care of the populace. There's certain things that we must learn from the Scandinavian countries of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. They have succeeded in finding a very useful mix in that regard. Number two, as regards the involvement of indigenous people, I believe that there are certain areas that must be ring-fenced for the indigenous people. You simply say, in these areas, the indigenous people will be the ones who will be allowed, and if anybody comes into our country and wants to strengthen them, we'll allow foreign participation up to this percentage on the basis that there will be transfer of knowledge and technology within a certain period. And once you do that, then you have a situation where the outsiders are coming to add value, and you open your market very slowly, and as you open the market, you also strengthen the local populace. The third thing that I want to say, the belief by some individuals that you can cocoon yourself in an environment and then realize true progress and development is completely misguided. History demonstrates that you must be cross-pollinated and cross-fertilized. And once you are so cross-pollinated and cross-fertilized, then you grow. The history of the United States of America, the history of Europe, the history of Japan, and even China now is creative opening of the market. The problem with many African countries is that we just allow people to come from everywhere and begin to sell tomatoes and sell chicken. We can sell our tomatoes, we can sell our chicken. Preserve that. And once you do that, you'll discover that the people are then lifted and the economy also grows, and you also grow, you ensure that there is innovation and invention which is indigenous and homegrown, because the world is globalizing. And if you think that you are going to immunize yourself, you'll discover that you are so far apart from the world that you become primitive a la North Korea.
Thank you very much, Prof. Welcome, Alfred Masokola. We have seen in the past our state-owned enterprises or parastatals collapsing, going back to government to seek guarantee on facilities from banks in billions, and they still fail again. Is our problem in our state-owned enterprises leadership, or we need to do away with state-owned enterprises? Just so I get all your views. Then before you tap into what Professor Lumumba was saying, I want us to wrap this conversation in the human capital. Do we still need vocational education?
Thank you, Rabbi. I 100% believe that we still need state-owned enterprises. I think we have seen in other countries how important they are to an economy, especially a country like Botswana. If you look at the structure of our economy, it is dominated by government, which means government plays a larger role than the private sector. You look at public procurement accounts for 70% of the GDP. It means most of the business is actually in the government hands. And in terms of the collapsing of these state-owned enterprises, I think it's a problem of leadership and, of course, interference from government, not wanting to appoint the best talents and interfering with what these institutions do. And, of course, corruption that we see, comrades, that is happening in public enterprises. But my belief is that we still need them. They can play a larger role in creating jobs and in creating big institutions that can drive Botswana's economy. I think we do need them.
Vocational education?
Yes, we need them. Okay, let me say this. I was in Japan a month ago, and one of the things that I appreciated about their economy and what they do to themselves is the ability to create things for themselves. The ability to create cars, technology, and everything. And you cannot, the kind of education that we have here is for people who work in offices, and that's it. And that's not where we can create jobs. I think what we need is to go the vocational way, to create things for our economy, to create jobs, and that's what we can do.
Let me just add to something that is said. There is this assumption that when the state is present in the commercial arena, then it doesn't do well. Look at the Ethiopian Airlines. The Ethiopian Airlines is the only profit-making airline in Africa, and is state-run. What they have done is to ensure that private sector characteristics are given the pride of place in the day-to-day running of the state enterprise. So what one wants is to have an environment where profit is an objective, but also welfarism is an objective. And I think that that can be done, and there are certain areas which you engage in, not for purpose of making profit, but for purposes of providing service to the community.
Creating jobs.
Yes.
Professor, the human capital. As Botswana goes out to seek FDI, partnerships and ventures, investors come here and they say, you know what, it is going to be difficult for me to go to Japan and bring in the human resource here to assemble a car because locally there's no one who does that. There's no one who can do that. I'm going to have to borrow the human capital as expatriates, pay them expatriates allowance, find places for them to stay. How does Botswana fuel its human capital as a critical component in transforming this economy?
Let's go back to education. What kind of education are we offering in our primary schools, in our universities? We've got to revamp our education. Once we revamp our education and ensure that it produces young men and women who are capable of inventing and innovating, then we'll resolve this problem. And permit me to give a few examples. Look at Brazil. Until 1975, Brazil was a coup-prone country. Then the generals came into power in Brazil and they said, we lost so many years, we are going to make Brazil work. Today, Brazil produces jets, which are bought all over the world. Today, Brazil is in the area of innovation and invention. Look at Chile. Until very recently, about 20 years ago, Chile was a backwater country. Today, Chile is a middle-level economy. And what every other country does is first to address education. South Korea is a perfect example that the problem is not geography. Just compare North Korea and South Korea. Apart from launching missiles every so often, what else does North Korea produce? Nothing. But look at South Korea. It produces Samsung phones, it produces LG, it produces cars in Hyundai, it produces many things. The first thing, let us ask ourselves, this education that we inherited from the colonizers, is it serving us? Is it making us innovative and inventive? And once we do that, we ask ourselves, our universities, how many patents are we registering every other year? I believe that it can be done. The very fact that you are asking this question suggests to me that is already an issue not only in Botswana, but in Africa. That is why you hear this talk about STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This is now the thing that we are talking about, competency-based education. But the danger is that we are in the business of borrowing things, like we have the watch for keeping time, but it has become more of an ornament rather than an instrument for making us arrive at appointments on time. So we must borrow things and customize them and make them work for us. We can do it. And you must allow me to make this point. You know, sometimes when we talk about Africa, we talk about all the negative things that are happening in Africa,
yes,
as if nothing good is happening in Africa. I walk across this continent and I am convinced that things are beginning to happen. I come to my country, Kenya, and I see the mobile telephony and mobile money and how we have revolutionized the banking industry. And I think that things can be done. I see how you, in your earlier years, also managed to bring the De Beers and everybody else to deal with mining. You only need to go a notch higher. You go to Rwanda, Rwandese are now beginning to assemble telephones in Africa. You begin with assembly, then you begin to manufacture. You go to Uganda, University of Makerere have now come up with a solar-driven bus. It can be done. You go to Nigeria and see the beautiful things that are happening there. You go to Senegal, come to Kenya and see the wind power, the largest wind power farm in Africa. You go to Morocco. There are beautiful things that are happening in Africa. We should not just tell the bad stories. Because when we tell the bad stories, we think that Africa is a continent of nightmares without sweet dreams. There are sweet dreams and occasional nightmares.
Prof, can Botswana deliver electric car?
Deliver?
Electric car.
Yes, why shouldn't Botswana do that? The University of Botswana, if it took a conscious decision that this is what we want to do and our Department of Engineering is going to deliver, why can't it do it? There is no shortage of good men and women in Botswana, but there is a sense in which these have to be done in collaboration. Whenever I look at African countries, I came here, the sun was at 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Beyond electric car, why can't you produce solar-powered cars? So that you don't, there are many things that can be done.
Yes, Prof.
And the first thing is to believe that we can do it.
Yes.
Once we have the belief, look at little Israel. Little Israel is capable of doing amazing things. Why can't Botswana do that?
Talking of Israel,
Yeah.
if you go to Square Mart, one of the least shopping space at the Gaborone CBD, you can find a tomato from Israel. And Israel is just as much as a desert as us, but they produce food for themselves. But in the past, we have failed miserably to produce maize for us, amongst others. Can I tap into your views? Can we produce and deliver a hemp, industrial hemp sector?
Fail no more. Fail no more. And you can do that. You can produce industrial hemp. You can do all, there is nothing. Look at what Muammar al-Gaddafi did during the short period that he was in power, and he actually took water from the aquifers in the desert to green Libya. This thing that you think is a desert, this is no desert. This desert can be converted into a green area, and you can produce tomatoes, you can produce everything. With this combination of sun and water, there is nothing that cannot be achieved. And this is where political leadership comes in. When you have men and women who have a vision in positions of political leadership and a population that demands that the best be produced, there is no shortage of what can be achieved. I have no doubt in my mind that Botswana can achieve it.
When I read through Kenya's success and how it has been able to use cooperatives in the agriculture and the coffee industry, and even in the banking industry, should Africa tap into that?
I think there is a sense in which Kenya has been a leader in the cooperative sector over a long period. And this was very deliberate from the early years, that the only way in which you could encourage small-scale farmers to compete with the large-scale farmers is to put together their little efforts and have them in a cooperative movement. You've seen that, as I've already said, in the tea sector, in the coffee sector, in the pyrethrum sector, in the sugar sector, in the fishing sector. Some of them are not as strong as others, but the truth is that the cooperative movement in Kenya is the most successful in Africa, and I believe that there is something to learn from that sector. And indeed, many African countries do come to Kenya. We actually do now have a whole university called the Cooperative University of Kenya, which helps in this area to train other African countries. That is one area of success. In the banking sector, we don't say it as loudly as we should, but Nigeria is one of the leading countries in Africa. Aside from South Africa, Nigeria has major banks, the Zenith Bank, the UBA Bank, the First National Bank, and they are doing very well. And with a population of over 250 million, that is a market that can never be ignored. Another sector in which we ought to gain strength is in the insurance sector. The insurance penetration in many African countries, aside from South Africa, is no more than 3%. And this is a growth area. If we could convince our people to get on not only into life insurance, you get into livestock insurance and all these other types of insurance, pension funds, then we could be going very far going forward. So Africa is a continent that is on a growth trajectory, which we should take advantage of.
Thank you, Prof. I'm going to ask my colleagues here to ask last questions.